host, Bobbie Holmes. You guys, I am so excited for this week's story. We are stepping into my favorite era of infamous serial killers. Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Son of Sam, BTK, and John Wayne Gacy. I promise we will get to them all at some point, but today I'm here to talk about Edmund Kemper III, aka Big Ed, or you may know him as the CoEd killer. The best part about today's episode is that most of this information came straight out of Ed's mouth. Once he was in prison for his crimes, he was interviewed multiple times by psychiatrists, FBI agents, and the media. I'm actually going to be playing some audio clips throughout this episode. Ed was like an open book. He loved to talk. He calmly explained in detail how and why he carried out his murders and what he did to the bodies. Ed was a serial killer who engaged in necrophilia. If you're unfamiliar with that term, it means he had sex with the bodies after killing them. And it gets much more twisted than that, so this is your fair warning. If that bothers you, you might want to just skip this episode. His total body count is 10 people. 6 of which were young women he picked up hitchhiking around college campuses near Santa Cruz, hence the name CoEd Killer. But as usual, I want to start with Ed's childhood and upbringing, and unfortunately, it was a rough one. Ed was the middle child. He had an older and younger sister. His parents, Clarnell and Edmund Kemper II, had a very dysfunctional marriage. I'm just going to refer to his dad as Edmund from now on, and Ed will be Ed. It's less confusing that way with the Edmund II and Edmund III. So Edmund is dad, Ed is the son. Clarnell was an alcoholic with a domineering personality. Edmund was a World War II vet, and he commented at one point, "Suicide missions in wartime and the atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with her." Apparently everyone had a hard time dealing with Clarnell, especially young Ed. Every child has a game they remember playing growing up. Red Rover, hopscotch, kick the can. Well, Ed's favorite game was playing gas chamber and electric chair with his sisters. They would tie him up and they would pretend to flip the imaginary switch, and he would roll around on the ground as if he was being electrocuted or gassed. When Ed was in 2nd grade, he was a peeping Tom. He sat outside his teacher's house and watched her through the window. His sisters teased him and asked why he didn't just kiss her, which Ed responded with, "If I kissed her, I'd have to kill her first." Just imagine that coming out of the mouth of your 2nd grader. It's like 7 years old. Kind of crazy. When Ed was 10, he buried the family cat alive. Later, he dug it back up to play with it. He ended up cutting off its head and putting it on a spike. And for some reason, the family decided to get another pet cat. And Ed killed that one too, because he said it liked his younger sister more than him. I wonder why. He cut the cat into pieces and kept them in his bedroom closet. We talked last week in the episode about kids killing animals, and it's thought to be a precursor to murder, like practicing on the animal before you attempt to kill the person. Even Ed agrees.
It started with surrogates at a non-human level. Physical objects, my possessions, other people's, destruction of things that are cared about, and then destruction of things that are living on a lower level, small animals, insects, animals, and then finally people.
He does end up dismembering his victims, much like he did the second family pet. Maybe mental health wasn't taken as seriously back then as it is now, but warning bells should be ringing, and maybe Clarnell picked up on this behavior, but she definitely went about things the wrong way. She verbally and emotionally abused Ed daily. She told him he was a big weirdo. He was just like his dad, and no one would ever love him. She would belittle him and make fun of his size. Ed was actually born 13 pounds, which is a huge baby, and would eventually be 6'9". And that's where the nickname Big Ed came from. In 1957, Edmund and Clarnell separated. And this was devastating to Ed because he was very close with his father and was left in the care of his abusive mother in Montana. Clarnell had it in her head that Ed was going to sexually assault his sisters, so every night she locked him in the basement. Ed reported being terrified locked down there by himself amongst the rats running on the floor. Ed grew tired of the abuse, and at age 14 he ran away to California to find his father. When he finally got there, he found that his father had remarried and had a new son. Ed didn't quite fit into this new family picture that Edmund had, and he was sent to live with his paternal grandparents. Ed had a hard time with the rejection from his father, and living with his grandparents wasn't much better than living with Clarnell. He said that his grandmother was constantly emasculating him and his grandfather, and that was something his mother and grandmother had in common. They seemed to have a strong anger and hatred towards men. In 1964, Ed was 15 years old. He was having one of many heated arguments with his grandmother, and he'd had enough. He got up from the table, gets his hunting rifle, and shoots her once in the head and twice in the back. His grandfather actually wasn't home at the time. He waited for him to get back, and he shot him in the driveway. Ed said he just wanted to know what it would feel like to kill Grandma. He didn't want to kill his grandfather, but he didn't want him to go through the trauma of seeing his wife murdered. Which is nice, he didn't want to put his grandpa through trauma, but I'm not sure that murdering him was the way to go. Confused on what to do next, he calls Clarnell, which she told him he should call the police, and he did. He called and he turned himself in. He was taken to a Atascadero State Hospital, and that's where mentally ill convicts serve their sentences. He was initially diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, but after several sessions with psychiatrists, they disagreed with that diagnosis. They said that Ed was very smart, he was a model prisoner, he didn't show any bizarre behavior, delusions, or hallucinations that one would have with paranoid schizophrenia. An IQ test revealed that he had an IQ of 145. An average IQ is between 85 and 115. And it's actually really rare that people have an IQ over 130. So he's really smart. He received a new diagnosis of passive-aggressive personality trait disorder. I wasn't familiar with this term, so I gave it a Goog. Some examples of this disorder involve avoiding direct or clear communication, evading problems, fear of intimacy or competition, blaming others, playing a victim, and hiding anger. Ed was a very likable guy. All the hospital staff reported that he was a hard worker and had a pleasant demeanor. He was trusted enough by the doctors that they actually trained him to give psychiatric tests on other inmates. During this time, he actually memorized the answers that the psychiatrists were wanting to hear and used that in the future for his exit evaluation. He was like a sponge, absorbing information from other inmates. He said he actually learned a lot from interviewing the sex offenders. For example, it was best to kill a woman after raping her to avoid leaving witnesses. However, it seems like Kemper actually preferred to rape post-mortem. On his 21st birthday in 1969, he was released on parole. His parole psychiatrist stated, "If I were to see this patient without having any history available or getting any history from him, I would think that we were dealing with a very well-adjusted young man who had initiative, intelligence, and who was free of any psychiatric illnesses. It is my opinion that he has made very excellent response to the years of treatment and rehabilitation, and I would see no psychiatric reason to consider him to be of any danger to himself or to any member of society. And since it may allow him to have more freedom as an adult to develop his potential, I would consider it reasonable to have a permanent expunction of his juvenile records." Poor guy, I bet he was just kicking himself later. At 21, he was technically an adult, but he hadn't been in the real world since he was 15 years old. He ended up back living with his mother, who continued her emotional abuse on him. Ed started to attend a community college in hopes of becoming a police officer. His dreams were crushed when he found out he didn't meet the height requirement. At 6'9", he was actually too tall to be a police officer. In spite of his rejection, he began hanging out with off-duty policemen at a local bar called the Jury Room. He was somewhat of a police groupie and was often involved with conversations about ongoing cases. Ed took a job with the State of California Division of Highways. He saved up enough money to move out of his mother's house and get his own apartment with a roommate. Ed had no experience with women and honestly didn't even know how to talk to them. So he began picking up hitchhikers in his Ford Galaxy and engaging in conversations for experience.
My inability to communicate socially, sexually, I wasn't impotent. But emotionally, I was impotent. I was scared to death of failing in male-female relationships. I knew absolutely nothing about that whole area. Even if just sitting down and talking with a young lady. I need to be able to really communicate, and ironically enough, that's why I began picking people up.
He picked up approximately 150 hitchhikers before he started having dark fantasies. He started keeping knives, handcuffs, blankets, plastic bags, and eventually a gun in his car. His urges became so strong he began acting on them. He picked up Marianne Pesce and Anita Lucchese in May of 1972. And I'm so sorry, I'm probably doing them a disservice. Both their names are Italian, and I hope I didn't butcher them right now. They were walking around Berkeley and needed to get back to Stanford, where they attended school. He agreed to give them a ride and started driving in that direction. Without the girls noticing, he started venturing off route and eventually took them to a remote location. He handcuffed Marianne and locked Anita in the trunk. Both girls were stabbed and strangled. He put the bodies in the trunk and drove back to his apartment. On the way home, he was actually pulled over for a broken taillight. The officer didn't notice anything abnormal and he let Kemper go. He was almost caught on his first killings. Well, his first CoEd killings anyways. Obviously, he already killed his grandparents. His roommate wasn't home, so he took them inside where he photographed them. He had sex with their corpses. He cut them into pieces and put their body parts into plastic bags. He went to a spot in the mountains where he threw the bags of the body parts down a ravine. And this is where it gets really weird. First, he had sex with their severed heads before throwing them also down the ravine. Decapitation becomes something he does with all of his victims. In one of his interviews, he was asked what is the fascination with decapitation. He said, quote, "He can remember his dad cutting off the heads of their pet chickens to cook for dinner, and it could have been as simple as that, but he didn't think so." Whatever that means. In September of 1972, a 15-year-old Aiko Ku was headed to her dance class but missed the bus. She attempted to hitchhike to class. She never made it there because Ed was the one to pick her up. He drove her to a secluded area and held her at gunpoint. For some reason, he ended up getting out of the car and realized he was locked out. Even though he just had a gun to her head, Aiko apparently saw the softer side of Ed. She ended up unlocking the car and letting him back in. What a trusting, sweet soul. Who is to say what you would actually do in these type of situations, but I wish he had put the pedal to the metal and got the hell out of Dodge. But after regaining access to the car, Ed bound, gagged, and suffocated her. He covered her with blankets and put her in the trunk. But he didn't go straight home this time. He actually stopped at the bar and had a few drinks first. Once he got her home, he again raped her body, dismembered her, more rape, and disposed of her in a canyon. Body parts of missing girls began washing up on beaches and were found in the mountains. Police have noticed that those missing people had been hitchhiking and suggested only catching a ride from people who had a campus sticker on their car. Clarnell had worked at the University of California in Santa Cruz, so Ed actually did have the sticker on his car, and he had no trouble continuing to pick up victims.
My mother worked at the campus, and I had an A sticker on my car and obvious access day or night to the campus. I was picking up some very lovely young women. You know what we were talking about as we're driving around? Almost as often as not, this guy that's going around doing this stuff. And the second they started talking that, they didn't realize it, but they were getting a free ride. I couldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole, I swear. You know, but they'd be telling me all about this guy, and they're comparing notes and speculating on what he looks like, how he carries himself, why he's doing this stuff, telling me about it.
So how come they get in a car with somebody at that time?
She judged me not to be that guy.
There's not a particular look to a serial killer, just like stranger danger, stay away. In January of 1973, he was back living with Clarnell, and I don't think this was by choice. It seems like he was maybe having some financial difficulties. He picked up 18-year-old Cindy Schall around Cabrillo campus. Once he got her in a remote area, he shot her with a .22. He drove back to his mother's house and hid her body in the bedroom closet overnight. Once Clarnell left for work the next morning, he took Cindy's body to the bathtub, where he cut off her head. He removed the bullet from her body so there wasn't any evidence to trace back to him. Then he threw her body off of a cliff, but he kept her head, and he kept it for days. He just repeatedly had sex with it. After a few days, he buried Cindy's head in the garden outside. He buried it facing his mother's bedroom window because, quote, "Mother always wanted people to look up to her." Creepy. In January 1973, Ed had a huge blowout fight with his mother, as he usually did before killing. He ventured out to see if he could blow off some steam. Ed stopped to pick up two girls, 23-year-old Rosalind Thorpe and 20-year-old Allison Liu. Allison was hesitant to get in, and Ed said he had this trick that always worked where he would look at his watch if he was asking himself, like, do I even have time to give them a ride? Which would then usually ease any uneasy feelings, and Allison did eventually get in the car with Rosalind. After shooting both of them with the .22, he drove back to his mother's house, where he decapitated them in the trunk of his car, out in the open, where any nosy neighbor could probably have seen what he was doing.
It's getting easier to do. I was getting better at it. I was getting less detectable. I started flaunting that invisibility, severing a human head, two of them, at night in front of my mother's residence, with her at home, my neighbors at home upstairs, their picture window open, the curtains open, 11 o'clock at night, the lights are on. All they have to do is walk by, look out, and I've had it.
Then he put their heads in camera bags and brought them inside. And I'm sure you know what he did with them next. The next morning, he removed the bullets and discarded both bodies and heads into a canyon. At this point, Ed psycho-evaluated himself.
You were involved in the campus because your mother worked there.
Yes. I was also involved in killing CoEds because my mother was associated with college work, college CoEds, women, and had a very strong and violently outspoken position on men for much of my upbringing. My mother was a sick, angry, hungry, and very sad woman. I hated her, but I wanted to love my mother. And I watched the alcohol increase. I watched her social life drop off. I watched her get bizarre. She had terrible pain from her life, earlier life, her upbringing, a failed marriage with my father. I'm a constant reminder of that failure. I hate to distill it down into such into one-word realities like that. There's a lot that leads into that happening, but that is what happened. They represented not what my mother was, but what she liked, what she coveted, what was important to her. and I was destroying it.
He knows why he's killing these girls, CoEds in particular. It's his way of killing his mother over and over. He has a realization that no more girls should have to die because of her. He decides to pick up some girls and see if he can resist his urges. He finds 2 girls that need a ride, and he was able to take them to their destination without harming them. He even drove right past the site where he killed Marianne and Anita and just kept on driving. He said he had the gun with him and everything. He knew it wasn't about the college girls. It was about Clarnell.
And that's when I decided I'm going to murder my mother. I knew a week before she died I was going to kill her. And she went out to a party. She got soused. She came home, went to sleep. I was woken up by that. I came out. I walked up to her bed. She's laying there reading a paperback, as many thousands of nights before. And she said, "Oh, I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now." Shit. I looked at her. I said, "No." I said, "Good night." And I knew I was going to kill her, you know? And I'm so cold, it's so hard. And that's the first time in 10 years I've looked at it that way. I mean, that intensely, that honestly. It hurts.
After telling his mother good night, a few moments later, after she had fallen asleep, he bludgeoned her with the claw of a hammer. He decapitated her, and do you know where I'm going with this? Yes, he had sex with his mother's severed head. Then he proceeded to play darts using her head as the dartboard. Like, wow, he really hated her. He put her head on a shelf and he yelled at it for an hour. He cut out her tongue and her larynx and he put them in the garbage disposal. He said that seemed fitting as much as she bitched and screamed and yelled at me over so many years. He hid her body in the closet and went out for a few drinks at the bar. He needed some time to think of a cover story, and he ended up deciding that he would say his mother and her friend Sally Hallett had gone on a vacation. But he would have to get rid of Sally for that plan to work. So he invited Sally over for dinner and a movie, and I'm assuming that Sally thought Clarnell would be there. When Sally arrived, he strangled her. It doesn't say anywhere that he dismembered or raped her corpse, so he must be over that now that Clarnell is finally gone. He left a note for police. It said, "No need for her to suffer anymore at the hands of this horrible, murderous butcher. It was quick, asleep, the way I wanted it. Not sloppy and incomplete, gents. Just a lack of time. I got things to do." I think his remark was because Clarnell often told him, "I hadn't had sex in over 7 years because of you. No one wanted to be with the mother of a murderous son." And I'm sure it had nothing to do with her personality. So, taking caffeine pills to stay awake, Ed drove 3 straight days without stopping to sleep. He ended up in Pueblo, Colorado. He was driving because he assumed there was going to be a manhunt after him, and he was listening to the radio, but he didn't hear anything reported on the news, so that's when he decided to go ahead and pull over and call the police from a phone booth and confess. Remember, Ed was friends with the local police, so they didn't believe his confession. They almost laughed it off, like, no way Ed could do that. Like, big friendly Ed, no chance. So he waited for a few hours and he called back and he confessed to the murders of his mother, Sally, as well as the 6 CoEds. And he sat and calmly waited to be arrested.
Why did you wind up giving yourself up?
It had to stop. It had to stop. Once my mother was dead, there's almost a cathartic process at that point. I got physically ill right then when she died, when I murdered her. And once she was dead, there was no way I could back out. I had backed down from giving up 1,000 times. You know, so I rationalized that to give up would be insane. To give up would be crazy. But I look back on that and wish I had earlier, when I was saying those things to myself. The people who were later dead wouldn't be. The regret that came later would have not had to be. Those people, not things, those people would still be with their families, with their loved ones. They would have their own families. If I had had the courage to make that decision, instead of painting myself into the corner.
It's not typical for sociopaths to turn themselves in for their crimes. I think most serial killers show no empathy, but Ed did seem to feel sorry for what he did to those girls, and I'm not sure he had remorse for what he did to his mother, although he did get a little emotional in the interview that I played for you while talking about it, and that was about 10 years later. Kemper was found sane and guilty of all murder charges. He asked for the death penalty, or death by torture. Interesting. But he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison, which he is still serving at the California Medical Facility. He says he likes life in prison. He has waived his rights for parole since 1985. I mentioned the Netflix show Mindhunter in my first episode. The characters Holden Ford and Bill Tench, who are actually based on real-life people, John E. Douglas and Robert K. Ressler, they interview and study serial killers to try to understand the psyche, essentially helping profiling and catching the bad guys. Their first interview on the show is with Ed Kemper. The actor who played Ed, Cameron Britton, he did an amazing job at reenacting that original interview. He actually had an Emmy nomination for this role. I find the show so interesting, especially that it's based off of true events. So if you haven't watched Mindhunter, definitely get on Netflix and check that out. So I do have a couple interesting pop culture facts. Silence of the Lambs character Buffalo Bill was actually based off of Ed Kemper in the part where he fatally kills his grandparents as a teenager. And there's a quote from American Psycho. The character Patrick Bateman said, and it's actually mistakenly quoted for Ed Gein, instead of Ed Kemper. So they totally got that wrong. This was Big Ed. The quote in the movie was,
"Do you know what Ed Gein said about women?" Ed Gein, maitre d' canal bar? No. Serial killer, Wisconsin in the 50s. What did Ed say? He said, "When I see a pretty girl walking down the street, I think two things. One part of me wants to take her out and talk to her, be real nice and sweet and treat her right." And what the other part of him think? What her head would look like on a stick.
That was Ed Kemper. I know this was a disturbing case, but it's one of my favorites. I used Wikipedia for most of the history on Ed's life. The rest of today's information came straight from Ed in the documentary Murder, No Apparent Motive. Be sure to follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Killer Stories Podcast. You can send me any story suggestions to killerstoriespodcast@gmail.com. Next week is actually a story suggestion from my sister Sean, which I'm so excited about. Until next time, this has been a killer story.